General and Reserves, Professor Amos Gilad. It's indeed very moving. I'm not accustomed to interview the Honorable former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, such a legendary person, and thank you very much for agreeing to come, and thank you for your patience. There were some changes in our schedule. The emphasis we would like to place here in this conference is not necessarily on the legal aspect, but rather national security and the way you perceive it from your experience. And you said something that I cannot forget, many such sentences, but this is a source of inspiration. By the way, the applause you've just received, it simply inspires us and tells us, indicates in which direction this country needs to go to. It's not just an appreciation of you personally and everything that you've done. That's the way I perceive it, at least. You've said that the government took over the Knesset, and that's contrary to the concept of democracy. And then there's one person who took control of the entire government slowly. In political science, we call it politely formal democracy. You have a similar democracy in Russia as well. They have a parliament. They have a full separation of authorities there, but hopefully we won't get to that model. How can you decide in such a model? We've just seen we went to war to topple the regime. Who do you consult with? Where's the cabinet? Where are there decision-making institutes? Isn't there some bad spirit that took over in the professional institutions that are supposed to consult? I'm saying this from my experience. You, of course, have a much broader one, so go ahead. Hello, everyone, and thank you. As you all know, I belong to Reichman. I've been teaching here, I think, since 2010. I've known Amos, I think, for 43 years, perhaps even longer than most of you have known him. But I won't say why and how. That's still a military secret. If he wishes to tell, he can do so, but I'm not going to do it. Maybe we can reverse this interview and make it all about me. Yes, we are a democracy that is in a dangerous situation or under threat. We are a democracy that's on a collision track with a non-democratic reality, definitely a non-liberal one. Like I said, we're living in a democracy that is there's no longer the feeling that we are citizens, but rather maybe serfs. And this reality, it has many reasons, and it has a long history. It didn't just start now. Separation of authorities here in Israel, it doesn't exist. Checks and balances doesn't exist. Not just now, it didn't exist in the past as well, but now it stands out even more. First of all, the prime ministers. The Prime Minister, you know, I was there during the time of Prime Minister Rabin in his first term in office, and also during Begin's time when Begin, I was still with him in Camp David, and he would always say, they say that the Prime Minister is first among equals. So what does that mean? He would say, that means that the ministers see him first, and he sees them as equals. But we no longer have that. That doesn't exist. I don't think that the ministers see the Prime Minister first because they have such an option, because the Prime Minister doesn't see them, consider them to be his equals because of our election system that even Ben-Gurion wanted to change it, but failed to do so, and that primaries that came with some major problems. The Prime Minister controls the ministers. I remember recently when this government was founded, we saw the ministers standing in line and they wanted, because they wanted to get an appointment, he was just sitting there like the emperor and said, you will go there, etc. The Prime Minister controls the government, and the government controls the Knesset. A Knesset member is a chair of a committee, and he's not willing to cooperate with the position of the government. If that's the case, they replace him. That happened during COVID, if you remember. I don't remember her name. She headed the Education Committee, and her policy was contrary to the government's position, and they immediately replaced her. We don't have checks and balances inside Israel. So if the Prime Minister controls the government and the government controls the Knesset, then who can say to the Prime Minister, you are acting illegally when you do this or that? The answer is that only the court. That's why they consider the court as something that they need to completely change so that we can choose our own judges. It started with Ayelet Shaked, but it is now continuing in full speed, and they've already changed the law. The law already exists, but somehow miraculously it will only get into effect after the elections. But the change has already been made, and the change is that politicians, and only politicians, are the ones who will elect judges in Israel. So therefore, ladies and gentlemen, we're in trouble. I heard the talk earlier about the security problems, but we have we're in other kinds of trouble as well, the legal trouble as well, and it's all related. Amos had asked from the security perspective, and Lieberman said that here just a few minutes ago. With whom does the Prime Minister consult? Who can say no to him? There's no one who can say no to the Prime Minister. There was a comment, I didn't hear, but he said maybe. Our situation is very difficult from a constitutional perspective, from a legal perspective, and from a security perspective. That's your topic here. So we must have change. And everybody asks me, are you optimistic? And I say yes. I am an optimist by nature. I'm optimistic. How come you're optimistic? I'm optimistic because there's a light at the end of the tunnel. What is that light at the end of the tunnel? Elections. This is what makes me optimistic. Nothing else does. So I'm curious to ask you, how can it be that a country agrees that they curse the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and, legally that position is a national institution? How can it be that a law is being passed? How are they not ashamed of themselves? It's not even legal. They call it the Bible students, but it's blasphemy. How come everything can pass? And that reminds me of that famous verse of Chief Justice Chayut, and she said, the fortress hasn't fallen yet, but it seems to me that there are a lot of cracks already in this fortress, and it's about to be completely collapsed. And how come 11 versus 0 voted the way they did in the court? And I have many other questions, but I don't want to talk too much. I want to hear what you have to say, how you see it from a broader perspective. And I have to mention the Attorney General. And you were very prominent when you were in this position. She looks like Samson, the hero to me, but she's slowly finding herself all on her own, and we, put all our hopes on the elections. But what if things don't change? Look, I believe that there will be elections. I believe that the elections will be honest elections. And just like Lieberman said a few minutes ago, I mean, the entire opposition is working on that, and they're all cooperating regarding the elections system. I truly trust the Deputy Chief Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Noam Solberg. I know him personally, and he'll make sure that these will be pure and honest elections without any tricks. And as for your question, how come there is such a reality that this is how they treat the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court? The answer is that this government, this Minister of Justice, he's only talking in terms of authority. I have the authority not to convene the committee for the appointment or selection of judges, so I didn't convene it. Why? Don't ask why. I simply have the authority, but he did forget that we have 70 years of judiciary work in Israel, of administrative law, that says that power is a necessary condition for any act of government, but not a sufficient one. The governmental activity needs to be based on relevant matter-of-fact considerations, etc., etc. There shouldn't be any conflict of interest. And if there's a claim that a certain action is not constitutional, you cannot decide whether or not it's constitutional. The court should decide whether or not it's constitutional. But all that, it's not part of the discourse of the Prime Minister and the Minister of Justice. And by the way, Netanyahu wasn't like that throughout the years. I knew him very well. We would meet often. He was a great defender of the judiciary, but something happened. That's not him. He's now destroying this system, and I think, and that's, psychoanalysis, but I believe in it. I think that that's, the lawsuit against him, and we need to think perhaps it's high time we change this method. That is, there can be a court case against a prime minister, but only after he ceases from being a prime minister. Under the existing system, the existing law, the prime minister, and I'm not blaming the judges or anything like that. The judges on the panel, I know them all very well. They're all excellent judges. No, I think that the method in which Prime Minister is accused in a criminal case and there is a lawsuit against him, it simply cannot work. And we see that it's not working, so therefore we need to change this method, for example, to the French method, that an indictment, a letter of indictment is served and there is no obsolescence period, and you wait for the elections, and then you can conduct the court case. That's the case in France. Both Sarkozy and his predecessors, that's what they did with them. There are, of course, some disadvantages or faults to this method, but they are not as bad as the faults in our system that simply doesn't allow to conduct a clean criminal court case without background noises, and that needs to be finished off as quickly as possible. And you know, by the way, that I did try, in contrast to the opinion of my colleagues at the time, I did try to come up with some kind of a plea bargain between the defense and the prosecutors, and it was Bibi who approached me to do it. Rabello approached me to do that, his own personal representative. And a side comment, I know Rabello very well. He's an excellent legal expert. I know his father. I think we studied together in law studies. And if Rabello wants to do something good, he needs to just stand up and say, I remove my candidacy. I withdraw my candidacy. A question that just popped to my mind now, I'm sorry I didn't ask it before, but when we were talking, I know to attest to this from my security involvement in various situations. The High Court of Justice, and a lot of people don't understand that the High Court of Justice contributed to security by the fact that it saved us from ourselves and from international law, and you volunteered to go to The Hague, to the ICC, and people don't understand. People always accuse it as if that's a solution, but we are going to face delegitimization in view of what's happening in Judea and Samaria, and nobody talks about it or writes about it. It's like a terra incognita, as they say in Latin. So where are we headed? Do you think maybe on being too harsh? I'm really, really afraid, because there's this wonderful verse, Am levadad yishkon, a nation rests on it alone. And together with China, we are 1.4 billion. The way it's divided inside, it's top secret. Don't share it. But what are we going to do about it? It's something crucial to our survival, I think. Look, when I heard that it is claimed that the state of Israel is committing genocide, I was completely shaken by that. As a Holocaust survivor, I was a 5-year-old child when it all started. This claim that the state of Israel is committing genocide in Gaza is incorrect. It wasn't correct at the time. It's not correct today. We did destroy a lot in Gaza. We exercised international humanitarian law in our activities in Gaza, but we did not commit a genocide. There's a huge difference between violating humanitarian law and genocide. Genocide requires premeditation, intending from the outset to destroy an entire people as a national unit, and that wasn't our intention in Gaza. We did violate international humanitarian law, and by the way, the General Prosecutor of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, I wasn't there, I was in the ICJ. When he issued the arrest warrant, he wanted to issue an arrest warrant. He asked the ICC judges to issue such an arrest warrant against the Prime Minister and Minister of Defense, and he said that we, the State of Israel, violated humanitarian international law. And then they asked him, why didn't you base it on genocide? And then he said, because there is no genocide. He said that. And he was right. There was no genocide. And I fought so that they won't put that stain on us. And I said to my peers, to my colleagues at the ICJ, they wanted to place Cain's mark on Abel. That's what is going to happen. They want to not allow the State of Israel, to forbid the State of Israel to carry out any kind of military activity in Gaza. And of course, they are not going to impose the same prohibition on Gaza, because it's not even recognized. In one of the verdicts, I wrote that the State of Israel is fighting terrorism with one hand tied behind its back, because it cannot, use all the combat methods used by the terrorists, because we have international humanitarian law that says which military measures can be taken and which are not allowed. And I said to my colleagues at the ICJ, I said, if you issue a warrant that the State of Israel cannot carry out any belligerent act in Gaza, the outcome will be that Israel will have to fight Hamas with both hands tied behind its back. And such a warrant wasn't issued. I consider that to be my own personal achievement, a major personal achievement. And I said to them, it's important that you understand, I'm not a representative of the government. I was appointed by a government that my opinion and its opinions are completely different. But I'm doing this for the sake of international law, for international law, and for justice in international law. Excuse me. Excuse me, sir. Excuse me. Please don't interrupt. I wanted to ask before we conclude, we could sit here and talk for like 10 years at least, but let's say if the Attorney General finishes her term and they'll split her role and people will disregard the law and the forces that are against the Zionist vision will grow stronger and the resources will get scattered. How do you see it from two perspectives? First of all, the optimistic one, like you said, that it depends on the elections, but if, God forbid, it doesn't happen like that and nobody knows what's going to happen, could you give us some kind of your own personal forecast or personal warning? Look, what the Knesset is currently trying to do over the past week or two, in the last week or two of its term, it's truly, these are things that will harm Israeli democracy for many years to come, because it's one thing to pass an unconstitutional law, and then another Knesset will come along and they can overrule this law. And also a basic law, they want basic law, a Torah study, such a basic law after the elections. If we have a new government, it can also be reneged. But there's an issue of appointments. What do we do with all the appointments? And it's a difficult question, because I, who really fought against the judiciary overhaul, the judiciary reform since its beginning, I've always fought it. I always say, in order to cancel what this terrible government is doing, we need to operate within the confines of the law. We cannot operate with their methods. In Poland, for example, they're faced a similar question because their justice government destroyed the Polish democratic system. But in the recent elections, they didn't win. But their president, who gets a right of veto, he's from the previous period. So they cannot cancel undemocratic legislation, but what can they change? Undemocratic appointments. For example, they replaced the entire the constitutional court. The presidium of the court was replaced. So how do we do that? Well, the Polish answer to that is the stoplight method. Red light means it's a terrible appointment, we're going to change it, we're going to overrule it. Green light, it's a good appointment, we'll keep it. Yellow light, we'll look into it and see and decide regarding that appointment. And I think the same should apply here. If we have a different Knesset, and in this Knesset, hopefully, one of the important things they're going to do is not just overrule or roll back that terrible legislation, but also all these changes they're introducing to the position of the Attorney General. It doesn't matter if they do it through a regular law or a basic law. Even if it's a basic law, it can be reversed and rolled back, because the Knesset as a formative institution cannot pass laws that undermine the Jewish and democratic core of the Declaration of Independence. This is why there are restrictions. This is why there is an unconstitutional constitutional amendment. But we need to be very careful in using these tools or these instruments when the time comes. So, fortunately, we still have gatekeepers who are continuing to function. One of them is the Attorney General, and she's wonderful. She is unafraid. Yes, sometimes her position I wouldn't necessarily agree with it, or the Supreme Court wouldn't necessarily agree with on specific topics. In other words, sometimes she can err and make mistakes. I hope she does, because that would mean that she's human and that she doesn't operate automatically, and even things that the Supreme Court said that are not like that. Maybe the Supreme Court is mistaken because it is human as well, or at least I hope. In one of my verdicts, I wrote, when I sit to judge, it's as if I'm on trial. So I am my own auditor and critique and reviewer, and she's excellent, and she has that capacity for self-reviewing, and since that's the case, and since she's not one of us, we'll continue cancel this position or put instead of it a role of an attorney general that provides advice, a state prosecutor that indicts, and somebody else that I don't know what he does, and they're going to accept this law. And when we talk about the traffic light method, I believe that this is a red law, and we need to tell that them, at least if you should instruct that it shall become valid only after the election. So if there are any personal appointments, I don't know what their plan is to fire the Attorney General. They already fired her, but the court says that, it's inadmissible, unlawful, this termination. And now then maybe you've been appointed to a different position, then your role has expired, and then there will be a petition to the Supreme Court. And what will the Supreme Court decide? I don't know, because there are judges in the Supreme Court who, from their perspective, are not, part of our milieu. And the Minister of Justice said no one from the Supreme Court judges he would never appoint as a judge. They're not up to the level of our judges, our quote-unquote. What's going to happen? I don't know. Hopefully the horizon will be clear, even though the horizon has this tendency, the closer you get to it, the farther away it grows from you. So, former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, I'd like to thank you for this fascinating and inspiring and important interview. Thank you very much.